Welcome to the Chameleon Academy show. My name is Bill Strand. I'm the host, and it's my job to bring you the best of chameleon content for the next 30, 45, 60 minutes. To start off with, there has been a lot of demand for Antilles. Antilles is a panther chameleon, and he is a gorgeous creature. And so I'm told we have a feature video with Antilles, and we're going to run it now. Go ahead. Is that it? Okay, I guess it's short, sweet, and living fast. Okay, well, with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the question and answer box. My first question comes from Nicholas Mark, who's Mr. Vivarium on YouTube and on Instagram. Let's see what Nicholas has to ask.
Hey Bill, Nicholas Mark here from the Mr. Vivarium YouTube channel and Instagram account, and I've got a question for you. Have you ever tried the Stephanotis plant, aka Madagascar Jasmine, and any of your chameleon setups? And if so, have your chameleons munched on them like the veiled? And if they have, were they sick? Were they not? What are your thoughts on this?
Hello, Nicholas. Thank you for your question. And the answer is yes, I have used Stephanotis with my chameleons. This is my Stephanotis that I have in my cage here. It's enjoying life with a thornless blackberry and a little nasturtium. Now, the important part about that question was actually, have I used it with a veiled chameleon? Because as we know, veiled chameleons like to munch on things. And so when people ask, is this plant good for chameleons? It has to be good for, does it provide structure? Does it provide water, drinking surface, and such like that? The second part is, can it survive in a chameleon environment? And third is the one that people mostly ask for, and which Nicholas is asking for, is would it be safe for a chameleon? And that last question is what we're going to focus on. The question as to whether it's going to be safe is difficult because different plants are safe for different animals. And what is safe for dogs and cats may not be safe for reptiles, and definitely what is poisonous for dogs, cats, and humans may be just fine for a chameleon. And so we in the community have a challenge as to figure out what plants are dangerous for our chameleons. And I can tell you that over the many years and decades, I've actually not seen a case where we've actually had plant poisoning in a chameleon. Chameleons routinely eat the plants that are on the toxic plant list, like pothos, schefflera. The most common plants that we use in chameleons are actually on the toxic list. And that's because they have oxalates in their leaves, and those are little structures that mechanically irritate the throat as they go down. The veiled chameleons have absolutely no problem with it, and they chow down their pothos without abandon. There's also other plants that are very toxic, like crotons, but veiled chameleons will eat the crotons and not suffer any ill effects. And so we're really experimenting in real time with the community and gathering information to figure out how to answer that question. I do want to warn you, be very cautious as to where you get your information as to what plants are safe, because most places will just take a human, cat, dog safe list and put chameleon over it. That's not accurate. On the Chameleon Academy, I specifically look for instances where veiled chameleons took a bite out of the leaf and showed no ill effects. And so on the chameleonacademy.com/plants, you're going to see a plant list, and some of them have a designation of veiled tested. And that means that we have a record of a veiled eating it and not having a problem. Now, just because we haven't run across a plant that we can say, okay, this did give veiled chameleon a poisoning, doesn't mean that there isn't a plant out there that will poison the veiled chameleon. And so we need to keep aware as to what's going on, because poison is, number one, a substance that is bad for the chameleon, and number two, is taken in enough dose that it's going to be toxic. And so with those two together, I mean, some plants may be toxic, but the veiled chameleon won't eat enough of it to become a problem. So there's a lot of moving parts here. But in conclusion, if you're looking for a plant for your chameleon that you know has been tested, you can go to the chameleonacademy.com website and take a look at the plants page, and you will find a handout that gives you a list of plant species that we've tested over and over again, as well as an entire description of how to use those plants. And as for you, Nicholas, yeah, I don't have the answer as to whether it would be damaging to a veiled chameleon, but they're wonderful plants. I love my Stephanotis, and if you test it out with your veiled chameleon, please let me know how it goes. Our next question comes from Tiny Tree Dragon on Instagram, who asks, how do you know which chameleon species to incubate with a diapause? Now, let me explain what he's asking. With chameleon eggs, some species require a diapause, and a diapause is a period of a couple of months where you have a much cooler incubation. And what this does is it resets the timing of the egg. For example, in Madagascar, you have a defined wet season and a defined dry season. The thing is, when you lay your eggs, you want your babies to hatch at the beginning of the wet season because that's where the cover's available, the plants are alive, and there's insects all over the place. If the babies hatch during the dry season, they will probably die. And so it's very important that eggs, no matter when they're laid, all sync up so they hatch at the beginning of the wet season. At least that is the high-level understanding that we have right now. So a diapause in incubation is where you take the incubation temperature down a significant amount for 3 months maybe. That resets the eggs so they all hatch at the beginning of the wet season. Some species don't need a diapause. Like a panther chameleon, you can diapause the eggs or not, and they'll hatch anyways. Other species are more sensitive and they require a diapause, or else they won't hatch at all. And so the question is, how do you know which species need a diapause and which ones don't? Now, to answer that question, I'm going to bring on an expert, and that is Michael Nash. Michael is working extensively with a number of rare species of chameleons from Madagascar, and I asked him, how is it you decide which species need a diapause and which ones don't? And so I asked Michael, how do you know what species need to be diapaused?
I have to give a lot of credit to madcam.de, and that's because they have reported the climatic conditions or the conditions of the environment for so many of these species. And they have this really handy chart that tells you the average lows, the average highs based on month. So I do that. I look at that for whatever species I'm working with, and based on the degree of difference, depending on the season, in temperature, that's partially how I pick. But in addition to that, I think about the life cycle that we know of, which is limited, for the species, and whether a diapause really makes any sense, like just biologically. Does it make sense for these animals to be delayed? What's going to happen if they hatch too early in the wild? Again, I've not been to Madagascar, but to the best of my ability, I've tried to learn about it. So does it make sense? So based on the climatic conditions, what the limiting resources are for that species as well. Like first for Antimena, for one thing, or one example, yeah, it's temperature to some degree because in the dry season it gets much colder at night, but the reason, at least it's been reported, that they all die is because it dries up and it doesn't rain anymore. So, well, why would that animal want to hatch out in the middle of some horrible dry season where even the adults can't survive? I'm talking about having a little bulb above the enclosure for babies and then they die. What chance is a little baby going to have in the wild if the adults are all dead, right? So I think about what's limiting the survival of that species in their habitat, and then how does the egg incubation history allow survival? So for Antimena, I'm experimenting with, and this is in part from discussions with Carl Coteau, but making them dry as a diapause, right? And not frying them, but modulating that parameter. because that's what's limiting, in addition to it being colder. So to summarize, I look at the temperatures, try to replicate it. If there's a clear dip, a big difference, right? Not like 2 degrees, but a big obvious seasonal difference. Number two, I think about what's limiting that species survival and how the egg incubation process might circumvent that issue. And I do that for each species.
Thank you very much, Michael, for coming on and answering that question. And what Michael is demonstrating is a skill that we develop as chameleon keepers when we start to get into more of the rare species. We have to start looking at what's going on in their natural habitat and try to figure out which of those environmental factors are important for their health or natural behavior here in captivity. All right, the final question is going to be about drainage trays. I mentioned this in a show before where I started talking about the need to lift the cage off of the bottom of the drainage tray. A drainage tray is a tray that goes under the cage and it catches the wastewater from your mister and drippers, and so it keeps it separate from all the poop and escaped feeder insects that are on the bottom of the cage. The thing is, if you get a tray from somewhere and you put the cage directly into that drainage tray, the water level will rise up into your cage. And so what you want to do is put on a standoff at the bottom of that tray so the cage is lifted up. And then you have about, half inch or so of space under there that the water can congregate and not be in the cage. Well, I got some questions as to how exactly I pulled that off. And it's very simple. It's just making a PVC frame. So those of us who are very good at breaking sprinklers every time we walk into the backyard, we're very good at this. But if you've never worked with PVC before, it may be a little intimidating. And so I've got this video here that's going to show you step by step how to put together a PVC frame. When water collects in the tray, we don't want the cage sitting in that water because it's just going to flood the cage, and that kind of defeats the purpose. You really can use anything to lift the cage up off of the bottom of the tray. I like to make a PVC frame, and I'm going to go ahead and show you what I do. It's pretty simple. I use 3/4 inch PVC pipe and a bunch of corners. I make a square frame for the cage to sit on, and that's it. It's pretty simple. So here's a couple of hints and tips on making that PVC frame. I'll tell you what I've done. First, I use the 3/4 inch size pipe. You can use any size PVC pipe, but 3/4 inch works really well for me. I use 90-degree elbow connectors, and that gives me a nice square frame. You don't have to use the PVC cement because when you push the pipe and the elbow connector together, they make a pretty tight fit. And since we're not carrying water, we're not worrying about leaking. Now, sometimes it is a little bit of a challenge to get the measurement down because you have to take into account how much of the pipe actually goes into the connector. And the way I do this is I take a ruler and with a pencil and I mark off 1/8 of an inch tick marks all the way up for an inch on the end of the pipe, and then shove it into the elbow connector. And that's going to tell me how far goes in. For my particular pipe and my connectors, I got in 1/2 inch. And so if I took into account the 1/2 inch there and how much the connector added to the entire length, it ended up that for a 2x2 frame, I would have to make 21.5 inch lengths of pipe. And finally, if you're going to be doing this for a wide format cage, like a 4-foot wide cage, I prefer to do two 2-foot wide frames instead of one 4-foot wide frame because it's easier to put together, adjust, and it gives me support down the middle. All right, it is now time for our main event, and that's going to be an interview I did with Jonathan Hill, who is the breeder behind iPardalis. iPardalis stands out because the I stands for individual, for individually raised pardalis, and Jonathan Hill has created an entire breeding facility of individual cages for his baby panther chameleons. Now that means he creates a lot of baby cages. And so I wanted to talk to him about how he did that. Specifically, how we take the environmental conditions that we're giving to the adults and we give that to the babies. You can't just take the T5 UVB lights and the 100-watt basking bulb of your adult cage and put it onto a baby cage because you're going to fry the little guy. And so I wanted to bring him on and talk about how you translate everything from the big cage down into the small cages. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Hill to the Chameleon Academy show. Hello, Chameleon Academy. This is Bill Strand, and I'm here with Jonathan Hill, and we're going to be talking about how to miniaturize your care sheet. And what I mean by that is we're all very good at putting together a cage that's 4 foot tall, but how do you take all those conditions and shrink it down to a baby cage if you're, say, keeping babies individually? Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
The reason why I have you on here is because you have done this a lot. With your individually raising baby chameleons, you have a lot of very small cages. And so you have a great deal of experience in miniaturizing the chameleon environments. So maybe we'll just start off with, why is it a challenge to create an environment in a small space?
Well, I mean, a lot of the lights are designed for larger cages. So when we start talking about T5 lighting as a standard, I think T5 is a little bit strong for a baby cage. But it's T8. I know a lot of breeders have sworn by T8. I haven't experimented with T8 too much, but yeah, I think you've covered it in previous discussions about a place for compact fluorescence in baby raising, in that it provides a smaller area of effective UVB, and a couple of other things that I think are pretty interesting options for people when they're trying to create a proper environment for babies.
Yeah, we when we're creating a larger environment, say a 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage, we use certain heat lamps that provide heat across a wide area, and the UVB that's meant to punch down a little bit into the cage. But when we put that on a baby cage, we essentially, you take a heat lamp off of a 4 foot tall cage, you put that on a baby cage, the entire baby cage is now being baked.
And when I first started thinking about this, I saw examples from Frank Payne, and I believe Chromatic Chameleons had posted some examples right when I was getting started in the hobby, and they had puck lights, so very small puck lights that they would place on the top of each of the enclosures, and I've done that. I think I have 2 racks right now that still have some puck lights on them. And there's a new light that came out over the past couple of years, the Nano. It's a very small heat source. And I've experimented with a bunch of different things for basking. And I've right now I have enough variety of like some with no heat, some with puck lights, some with the Nano heat, and I honestly haven't seen much of a difference. And I've used them all in parallel for years.
Well, I've gotten to the point where when I have a setup where I have 30 babies in their different cages, I end up not needing to put on a heat lamp on those cages, because just the lighting in the room brings it to an acceptable temperature.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you hit a point where your ambient gets too high, and you're regulating the entire room. You're turning things off to bring the ambient temperature down, and that's I've absolutely hit that point where you end up with too much heat and the whole room goes up.
Yeah, you end up rotating which lights are on at which time, so you don't overheat the room, because that heat just really builds up, and
it does.
I find, I can put heat lamps on each one of these cages, but they're just on for just the smallest amount during the morning, and then I've got to turn them off.
I do that with my basking, and now I also have my misters staggered, but that's just because I hit limits on my electrical box. So that was different requirement that I was trying to meet, but it was like, I don't want to have to keep going flipping the fuse on this to get it back up and running. But so I started staggering things for that reason, and it ended up being good for me because it forced me to think about when I really needed
Mm.
basking, when I really needed UVB. Um, and before I always had enough electricity, and then when I hit that point, I was like, okay, now I got to rethink this and stagger it. And ambient conditions are another kind of um, top level constraint that once you start to see your ambient conditions getting out of sync, then you have to start staggering, turning things off. And I I find that with juveniles and babies especially, the the heat itself, um, it's not a huge issue because you get enough heat from the UVB to get a gradient from the low 80s down into the 70s during the day, and then um, below 70 at night. And that's usually what I'm going for. I don't want high 80s. I don't want to see high 80s anywhere at any time with babies. Um, so I find that even with those puck lights and nanos, you can get to that temperature really easily,
Yeah.
and so I've even I'm pretty comfortable not using it at
All
all.
right. So just to give everyone the idea of what we're talking about, how many cages would you say is in your room?
Um, I think I'm up to 147, um, and I'm adding 18, so it'll be 160 something soon. Yeah, it's a
Okay.
decent sized room. As you hit those constraints and you're like, I need to set up more space, I need to expand, make sure you are providing everything that everybody needs. Um, it scales fast, and I know anybody who's tried it has had that same experience. So
If we boil it down, what is your strategy for heat
for heat,
right now?
my
Yeah.
strategy is to check ambient conditions and check the peak, like the peak basking location, and I'm looking for uh, mid 80s, low mid 80s at the peak, and I want to see it
Okay.
dropping into the low 70s somewhere in the cage. So
Okay.
yeah, I'm looking for a gradient, and there's so many ways to achieve that I've done it in a bunch of different ways, whether it be in the places where I do have basking with like a puck light or a nano, I tend to add more foliage
Mm.
to those.
Right.
So add more foliage, try to block it out because you can get a spot that's warm and prevent the ambient in the other parts of the cage from going up by blocking some of the heat with more foliage.
Now, you use mostly hybrid cages for your babies, correct?
Yep, yep.
And do you notice that there would be a difference in the heat retention between the hybrid cages and if you were using a screen cage?
It's a good question. I've noticed about 2 to 3 degrees more in the hybrids with a solid front than
Okay.
hybrids with a screen front. Um,
Okay.
but that's what I've observed. And really, what that means is when I have a hybrid with a solid front and a chimney effect, so screen bottom, screen top,
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Mm-hmm.
put I would definitely not put basking on those. Um, Maybe in different ambient conditions you could get it working, but in my room, no basking on those.
All right. So, what do you do as far as UVB?
UVB, I currently use T5, 6%, across the board.
And how far above the cage do you put that?
So I have a couple where it's raised up 4 to 6 inches off, and I have a couple where it's
Okay.
right on top. Um,
Okay.
and I published an article, I want to say about a year and a half ago, where I was measuring weights on very similar to the experiment, actually inspired by Michael Nash's experiment that he did with
Mm-hmm.
lateralis, and and I didn't find a statistical difference between the two from a growth and weight standpoint. Um,
And which UV indexes were you testing
six
between?
and three.
6 and 3.
Yep.
Okay.
And so that's an experiment I want to repeat um, because I do think that there's a difference, but I didn't find one.
Okay.
And so uh, the scientist in me says we got to repeat this experiment.
Hmm.
But I generally like variety, whether it be I don't like to have all of my cages do it in the same way because I want to be able to see if there's a pattern to an issue. So if I see an issue and it spans across the variation, then I know it's not related to the lights, right? Because I know I've got different lighting strategies in those two places.
Mm.
And so I
Yeah.
constantly am mixing and matching so that I can isolate what's going on.
Okay.
But
Yeah, I use a
yeah, what do
combination
you,
of T5 6% or 5.0.
okay,
Right now, I'm doing a lot with the Leap
nice.
5.0, and I have done a lot with the T8s. The T8s are very convenient when I don't have enough space above the cage. Like if I have a bunch of nursery cages and I'm just really packing things in and I don't have space to lift
Lift it up.
the T5
Yep.
up, then a T8 comes in very
Yeah.
handy because and the thing is, what people don't realize that T8, a 10.0 T8 is very similar to a 6%
Hmm.
T5. So if I use a 5.0, I get a nice weak UVB at the back corner of the
Hmm.
cage, and we know the chameleons will go into that
Yep.
UVB, and so it does allow me to have a small section of a small cage have sufficient UVB.
Absolutely.
So,
And one thing I also do is I make sure that my UVB is positioned in the front or in the back, but not in the middle, so that there is a kind of a horizontal way for them to get away from it, um, if they
yeah.
want to. So you just making sure that you're using a lot of foliage to prevent it from going all the way down to the bottom of the cage, and making sure that it's positioned so that there's just kind of like a quarter of the cage where there's UVB exposure.
Yeah, when you have a small cage like that, that's when having thick foliage becomes even more critical for than is in a 4 foot tall
Hmm.
cage, because it's not just for privacy; it's for literal protection from your light bulbs up
Yep.
there.
And kind of just creating different gradients. I think foliage is something that I use a lot, whether that be humidity or UVB.
Have you done much with CFLs?
I did in the very beginning. I haven't purchased a CFL in a long time. Um, so not much recently, no.
I never used to work with CFLs, but I did a whole class. I put together a class on how to work with the Chameleon kit and how to help people
Hmm.
transition from the Chameleon kit. And so I raised chameleons in the Chameleon kit just to show how it could be done. Not to say everybody should
Yep.
do it, but if you have a Chameleon kit, this is how you make it work in the meantime.
Hmm.
And so I ended up with a lot of extra CFLs, the Zoomed 5.0, the 13 watt, the very weak
Hmm.
one, and but I started using those on the baby cages, and they worked pretty
Cool.
well. I was able to get them to be effective, but then I didn't continue on, and I don't use those now because it's just unwieldy to have 8 of those in a row on each row of cages.
Yeah.
So that's just too much. It's better just to get a T8 bulb spanning across
Oh
them.
yeah. No, I know plugs are a real constraint at
Yes,
at some point.
yeah. But for everybody listening, these are the situations where it's worthwhile understanding the UVB bulbs and saying, instead of saying use this, don't use
Yeah.
this. All of them produce UVB, and it's worth it understanding your tools to know which is appropriate in certain circumstances. And so this is a case where the weaker UVB is exactly the tool that can be
Yep.
used. When it comes to hydration, people don't necessarily think about how much pressure those Mist King nozzles are under. And when you put a little baby right in front of a Mist King nozzle, that little guy's going to get blasted.
Hmm.
What do you do for hydration?
I kind of blast them. I'm gonna. I'm sorry,
Okay.
sorry, little guys. No, but I use Mist King on most of my baby cages, but I do pay attention to the distance from the nozzle to the closest branch, and I try to make sure that branches aren't right at the opening because
Mhm.
it disperses pretty quickly, and so for me, I'm like, okay, well, getting blasted at 1 inch is way different than getting blasted at 4 or 5. Um,
Mhm.
and it's just like UVB. If you're close, you're going to get it strong. If you're further away, it's not as bad. So I just think about how I'm setting up the cage, where the mister is positioned, and make sure that it gets good coverage on the foliage, but doesn't have a blasting location where they're going to get nailed in the shorter distance to the nozzle. Um, but yeah, and I think it's something that when you brought it up in previous conversations, I was like, yeah, I definitely should rearrange a couple of them because there were when you brought that point up at first, I was like, oh man, there's a couple where they could get nailed pretty bad, so I rearranged a few of them, but still do use Miss King primarily.
Well, I found I could use Miss King if instead of having it inside the cage, I put it on the rack shelf that was above the cage, and I had it pointed through the
Through
or
the
through the
screen, yep.
screen. Yeah,
Okay.
and so I was able to dampen it the pressure a little bit, and then I could, of course, could control where I put the branches that they
And
could perch
And
on.
those nozzles are a bit cheaper too, because you don't have to do the triangle attachment, and you can use
Yeah.
the nozzles that are designed for greenhouses versus with the screw attachment. Um, so
Oh well, that actually sounds that sounds pretty smart. No, I use a screw attachment.
no, but you could
I
you
like
could
that
get away
idea.
with the ones that are designed for greenhouses, and I think they're like $5 to $7
Yeah.
cheaper.
Oh man. All right, I'm learning
Yeah.
something. No, I put the screw attachment through the bars
Uh,
of the shelf, and I just screw it on down.
Yeah, but if they have some they sell. I bought them by accident once, and they sell them without the screw attachment, and then they're cheaper
Okay.
because they don't have that part.
Yeah. Nice. All right. I'm gonna look into
Yeah,
that. Now, do you use fogging at all?
I do. I don't use it on my babies currently. Um,
Okay.
this year was the first year that I started to use fogging in my hydration strategy. Um, and I've been looking at kind of like a whole room solution because I
Okay.
currently don't have a whole room solution for my Mist Kings, and if I introduced a piecemeal fogging solution, then it would get pretty unruly really fast. So
Uh huh.
I'm looking more at like solving it at the room level potentially next year. But currently, I do have fogging on four of my adult male enclosures.
Yeah, I like using fogging to help out with the hydration because that's a lot of humidity and I'm keeping the babies from getting dehydrated,
Hmm.
and so that's a lot less of the misting that I have to do to keep them
Yep,
hydrated.
absolutely. No, I think fogging is a great tool, and I completely agree with everything I've heard about it. That's why I've been starting to introduce it and then thinking about how to scale it. So, like the first thing I did was I'll set up 4 cages, get familiar with it, get comfortable with how to do it on a smaller scale, and then take it to the whole room.
When we are doing smaller cages, all of a sudden bioactive becomes something that is very
Mm.
useful. Obviously, a 4 foot tall cage and you have something bioactive down at the bottom, you're having trouble getting light down there, and the chameleon doesn't know what's down
Hmm.
there. But with a baby, they will interact with the bioactive environment a whole lot more.
Absolutely.
And I know you've done a lot with
Hmm.
this. Give us an idea of what you're doing and what effects you've seen on the babies within that environment.
Sure. So I've now done 3 or 4 different bioactive strategies with babies. I started in 2007 by doing bioactive tubs, so
Mhm.
sterilite tubs, and had bioactive substrate, plants, leaves, isopods, everything all in a like a 64 quart bin. And
Mm-hmm.
I used those for about 2 years, and then the UVB destroyed the plastic, and they started to become very brittle. And that I tossed all those after about 2 years. But what I learned was that they utilize the space, like all of the space in the layers of foliage, the leaves. They eat the small bugs that are in there, um, which gives them more variety to work with. It also, I tried to limit it to 4 babies. I think we talked about it when I was like thinking about this. I sent an email over to you asking about like what's a good number of babies in these tubs, and so I limited it to 4 per tub for 4 weeks before getting them out into their individual enclosures. Um, and I noticed that I felt like that gave them a good jump start, because there's a period in that first week where some are they fly out of the egg, they're ready to eat, they're ready to go. There's others that seem like they're still, say like digesting their yolk almost. They're not totally excited to be out. And those ones I find sometimes I'll be like, man, where'd he go? And then I'll look and they'll be hiding under leaves or resting in a place that would only be provided in a bioactive environment, high humidity, dark, and secure. And so I do see hatchlings behaving in ways that are very different from adults in a bioactive environment, and and I think that that's beneficial to give them that option if they're not quite ready to be exposed to the world. So that's one thing that I observed very early on. The strategies that I've used now since, I've been thinking about a way to do it with the old school Dragon Strand nursery cages, full screen, eight per row, um, and I haven't come up with a good solution for that. But with the newest design with the solid fronts, I've got a full rack of those in a using bioactive strategy, and I have Dale Tamura's 6 condos. I did a series of videos on those, like every week, showing it growing in on Instagram, and I really like both of those for my individual raising of babies in a bioactive environment.
And how long do you keep your chameleons in a bioactive environment?
So I start them there, and once they go individual, they'll either be in one of the individuals that is bioactive, or they will go into a sterile individual enclosure. And I think, like I've mentioned before, I do like having a mixture of bio and sterile, just like I think everybody should, because if you have a need for quarantine, you have a need, like there is a place for sterile husbandry, um, and I think that it's always good to have that option. If you identify an issue, you can isolate it, quarantine it, and deal with it in a sterile environment. Tear out your bio and start again. Um, but the the I would say probably right now I have about 50-50 as far as a mix, between bio and sterile for the 0 to 3 month range, and then mostly bio for all my females. My adult females are almost all in bios.
And do you notice any difference between them as they grow up in each cage type?
That's a good question. I have not tried to do a weight experiment like we did with the UVB. I think that would be a great way to answer that question. Um, but I haven't seen an observable difference across the 2 cage types. I've mostly
Okay.
seen just different behaviors that I wouldn't see in a sterile environment in the bio environment, and I think that the fact that it gives them those options is just a good thing. Um, so you also know that like you get a better humidity gradient in a bioactive environment, so um, I see less signs of like dehydration issues or anything like that. But I haven't tried to measure it by like say weight or something.
Yeah, I've done sterile and I've done bioactive, but I haven't done them side by
Yeah.
side, so I don't really have a comparison.
Yep. Yep.
Right now, I'm doing a lot of bioactive, and even if I'm using the screen cage, I have a soil floor and there's plants growing in it, so there's still an interaction and life there, and things find their way in. And just for the record, I do a lot of indoor keeping and outdoor keeping, and when it's outdoors, that's when I use screen cages. And whatever screen cage I have outdoors, I turn it into a bioactive situation. And I mean, in the most simple way, I just pour soil into the bottom of the screen cage and plant within the soil, and that it becomes bioactive very quickly, especially when it's outside.
Yep. I've been doing that now for about 2 years. I think that it's a great strategy.
Now, what I found is once I do that, I like to put coroplast, like 6 inches of coroplast on the sides so the soil doesn't dry out as quickly.
Okay.
I've taken to doing that and it's worked well.
I just don't mow. I just let it grow.
Mow?
I just don't cut the grass or anything around the outside, so there's kind of
Okay.
so that there's
see.
like a natural barrier to the soil.
Yeah, well, I've got, for my babies, I've got little cages, 30-inch tall cages, and so I've got to be very careful where they are as far as when the sun hits.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
yeah, we in California just have these crazy weather, and when it goes up like to 110, what the heck is that all about? Yeah, so my cages need to be mobile to
Get them out. Yeah.
deal with the situation.
Yeah. No, I have them right in the ground with wildflowers around them.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I love having them in the ground, and I mean that's bioactive right there.
Oh, yep.
I think one of the greatest things is having that heat sink in the soil when it's outside. Well, what you said before about the humidity and using the bioactive, that's one of the things I like very much. Is because as we're getting more and more aware of the hydration cycles of chameleons and how humidity affects their hydration, or at the very least, the level of dehydration they get, and the more humidity, the less dehydration. When I put soil at the bottom of my baby cages, it's a lot easier to maintain a hydration cycle with the babies, and I like that.
Yeah,
a lot.
you always have a nice high humidity base in the shadows, just like you get outside, and it's you actually have a gradient that's maintained without having to add water. I think that's the key. It's like in most of the situations before, we used to just mist more and try to raise up the humidity, but if you have a bioactive enclosure, the natural evaporation, natural humidity gradient in the cage is very useful.
All right, so in dealing with small cages, these baby cages, what would you say are the biggest warnings, things to look out for, or experiences you've had of things going wrong
in a baby enclosure? So the biggest thing for me is, and with babies especially, is the small poop getting into different nooks and crannies in the cage and you don't notice them. So like if in the foliage where they're drinking, you always want to make sure that that's very clean. And as you have thick foliage, sometimes there's places you can't see unless you really inspect, and just make sure that it stays clean, because that right there can stunt their growth if they don't have clean water to drink, and as a part of their hydration. So that's one thing. I would say also, if you notice that the babies are spending too much time directly under a UVB where the gradient is off, like it's too high, you've got to intervene immediately, because if they do that too much, that can stunt them as well. if they hang out in that high UVB space, just because babies tend to do that. Like babies, for whatever reason, are like, this is a great place, and they're like, no, it's not. And so that
For all we know, they may like the
yeah,
colors.
I don't know what it is,
I mean, really.
but they for whatever reason sometimes they'll gravitate to a place that's not safe. And so
Yeah.
intervening, uh, you can obviously achieve it up front, if you have the space and you've heard from all the people who have had bad experiences. Um, and I think that part of it is, um, it it it's just recognizing that issue. You say, oh, those babies are spending time in a place where they shouldn't. You can either, um, raise it up, adjust it, move the babies out. Like you do something to, change their pattern of behavior to get them, to prevent them from stunting. Um, because most of the time with babies, what I'll notice first is actually appetite. So, um, before anything becomes serious, you'll see that they're not eating, as much as they did, say the week before, or right when they hatch. And as soon as appetite changes, that's when you've got to like pay attention, figure out why, because they should be eating, they should be active, they should be, um, uh, moving around, and they'll look physically they'll look okay, but the behavior change is the first thing that I notice.
Well, the one thing that sticks out in my mind as something to watch out for is when you start using small cages, and we're going to use a scenario that we've got a lot of baby cages. That's what we're talking about here. If you have one baby, like you've hatched an egg or something, put it in a 2x2 by 4 foot tall
Absolutely.
cage. Don't worry about any of this stuff we're talking about. This is for if you have a clutch of babies and you're putting them in individual cages, which hopefully you are, please do that. Then this is the situation we're talking
Absolutely.
about. And so in that situation, the biggest thing that I've had to watch is that buildup of heat, because there's just, I have multiple racks in a room. And even though I have those efficient lights, I have LED lights and all these efficient things, the heat can just build up in that room. And especially if in a small cage, if you have those lights that are there above the cage, a lot of that heat's going into the cage. And so it may be warmer in the cage than it is in the room when you walk in. And those little babies, their bodies just aren't able to handle things that like adults can. So this is where I'm hypersensitive to the heat in a room when I have babies in the room.
Yep, absolutely.
So let's go to, say somebody's having a clutch of babies. They have eggs, and they're getting ready for when those eggs hatch. Maybe this is their first clutch. What would your advice be as to how to get set up to do a clutch of babies? And this is for everybody, this is a brain teaser I just threw on Jonathan. He didn't know I was going to ask him this. But let's go to the situation where you and we have professionally made cages for our babies. But say we have somebody who's just starting out who isn't going to spend that money investing in a cage that's going to last 10 to 15 years. What are some ways that you could do a first clutch without investing thousands of dollars? Any ideas?
Well, the tubs, it's part of why I got started with tubs, a mixture of tubs and individual enclosures, is because you just reach space constraints really fast with tubs because they're big. So I've seen some people do racks of tubs. And obviously, like I mentioned, they're only going to last a year, if that, because of how brittle they get when you're putting UVB on them. But tubs are a quick solution that work very well. Another one I've seen, I haven't done it, but I've seen people take, say like a Reptibreeze small and put a divider in it.
The nanos?
Yeah, no, the smalls and put a divider. I like it better than
Oh, okay.
I like that better than the nanos because you still get more vertical space. I think the big problem with the nanos it's just not tall enough as a cage size to get any kind of gradient. Um, I've used a couple just to see, and it's just a total waste of
Okay.
time. I've thrown them all out. Um, but with a small, at least you get enough of a vertical gradient, and if you put a divider in there, you can make two out of that. And I've seen some setups like that I think are pretty well done. So, and that's a little bit more cost effective as well. I've seen butterfly nets. I've never tried it, so I can't really speak to it. My hunch is that it's probably even worse than tubs, but that that's just my third party perspective. I have never actually attempted that. So
Well, they're essentially a flexible screen cube that's not screen, it's fabric. And so it's a temporary solution.
yeah,
It does, for relatively cheap, it does get you individual cages for your chameleons. And so in my mind, there's a huge benefit to
yeah.
that. But
No, it's definitely better than trying to cram 4 per cage or something because I was on a thread on one of the Facebook groups this past week where somebody had posted saying, well, what happened to this baby and what's wrong with this baby in a Facebook group, and it was pretty clear that baby had just been bit by a sibling, right on the face, messed up its eyes, and even had injury on its skull, and so that's what happens. It's not just aggression. Like people pretend like they can just pick out the aggressive ones. It's food. It's like they're going for the same food item. They're not really intending to bite each other, but they do. And it's like accidents happen when they're in the same cage. So it's just there's a lot of reasons why I personally say 4 to 6 weeks is the point where you've got to get them separated, because if they're growing at the right pace, that's about when they can start to hurt each other. When they're really little, they can't physically hurt each other. It's only an emotional thing, which they causing chronic stress and other things that will then potentially stunt them through immune compromise. So, and the other thing to think about, I think, with group raising versus individual raising is the direct parasite cycle is exponential. It's the shedding rate on a direct parasite, and the fact that there's more than one animal shedding in the same cage. If something gets in there, it can blow up fast.
oh my goodness,
Like much faster.
that would be a nightmare
we're talking
if
about
coccidia got into
like
something like
direct parasite life cycle in a single animal. When you add two or three more into a captive environment, that's just a recipe for disaster. So besides the psychological, like chronic stress, the immune compromise, the risk of parasite infection, there's a number of reasons. I mean, and you've talked about it before, but I just will reiterate, individual raising is the way to go.
Yeah, so the butterfly cages, and for those who aren't familiar with it, it's like a mesh cube that you're able to unzip, and it's meant to put butterflies in, so you can bring them to class or something.
Yep.
And I mean, you can use them for chameleons. You just put this mesh cube there. It's got a branch and maybe a plant or even a plastic vine or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got your individual cage. Now, it's hard to do a whole lot with that, depending on how big it is, but it's an option. All right, Jonathan. Well, I think that is a good discussion. It exposes people to some of the challenges of bringing things like the big heat and UVB and bringing it into a miniature cage there. Where are you going to be testing anything or trying anything different, experimenting in the near future?
I think now that we talked about it, it makes sense to do a biosterile experiment just to see
Okay.
how that impacts their growth rates. And I'm going to repeat the UVB experiment. That's been on my to-do list.
What do you think should be the results of that test?
I think that if we're reaching a UVI that's detrimental, we should see that in the data. So like if it's resulting in any kind of stunting or issue. Now, I think that there's potentially some long-term issues that you wouldn't see in their growth rates.
Yeah, I would be worried about organ damage that you wouldn't see for a little while.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a good question. I wonder,
And I'm also worried about sterilization. My new male Kapani sitting there crawling up under the the UVB light, and I've had to take him down a couple of times.
I honestly think it's just that they're exploring and it might like the light. They just like the bright light or something. But those are the two big experiments. I'm a data scientist, so I do listen to the whatever I see in the data and try to test it for statistical significance. And I know what my null hypothesis is, but I'm happy to get a null result. I'm happy to get a real result. Pretty open to whatever there is to learn.
And with that, we can close it off and say goodbye to everybody. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining. And we'll go on and we'll see what we can do with babies.
Thank you very much for having me, Bill.
And there you go, my friends. It seems like there's so much to learn about keeping chameleons. And it certainly kept me busy for many, many decades. And I love it. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing here. I want to thank all of those who contributed to making this show: Nicholas, Mr. Vivarium, Michael Nash, and Jonathan Hill. And oh yeah, and Tilly's too. And thank you for joining me here. If you would like to know more about the Chameleon Academy, you can find me at chameleonacademy.com. And there, if you'd like to hear more, you can sign up for the newsletter, which goes out every Sunday evening. Thank you very much for joining me here. Have a great week, and I'll see you next Friday.